hello everyone, and welcome back to the next episode of the Ask Evoke podcast. Um, each month we compile a list of questions that come into our email and through our social media that we try to give as detailed an answer as we can. And it seems like this is getting really popular. We keep getting bombarded. Last month we didn't even get through all the questions. But I think we might be able to sneak through today. I have a hard cutoff time, in about an hour and a half, so we'll need to end by then. But so my guest or my co-host today is Kylee Toth, coach at Evoke Endurance and World Cup skimo racer. Welcome, Kylee. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Scott. Yeah, lots of questions to plow through, but we'll do our best. And it's nice to join you. I'm in Italy here again. It's always different backdrops. I should just like put a flag or something maybe for
Or
it's
you
just
can just
different
blur
country
your.
every month.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you can get
yeah,
one of those
good.
fake backgrounds of,
Yeah, yeah, that'd
pretty
be fun.
mountain scene or something. Yeah.
Hmm.
Well, let's dive in because we got a lot to cover today. First question,
Sure.
and this is a really interesting one for me because I'm into the theory of training. It says, what are the areas of training theory that you find most people have the most gaps, and you would and you should or would learn more? And I think it means, but they should or learn more.
Yeah.
But anyway, I think we get the gist of this. So it's a great question. A few years ago, I would have said it's the importance of this aerobic base that we keep beating the drum about, and because I don't think people used to grasp the importance of that. And I'll very briefly summarize what that importance is. We've talked about it about a million times, but basically it's the aerobic base is developing the aerobic capacity especially in your slow twitch muscles, so that you can then begin to layer on higher intensity work and more specific training. It's not, an answer to everything, but a few years ago, I would have said that's what most people didn't get. Now,
Mm.
recently, well, in the past, I don't know, probably 3 or 4 years, many of you probably have seen that social influencers, YouTube channels have all jumped on this Zone 2 bandwagon. And well, it's great to see that they've finally wised up and they understand, oh yeah, this stuff actually has a value, and there's a reason that elite endurance athletes train so much at these lower intensities. But they missed some pretty important points, and which I am in the midst of writing an article about, and I'll post that here hopefully in the next couple of weeks, because I think those points are very important. So I would have said zone 2 and aerobic base training would have been the biggest factors that were being overlooked, or not well understood. Now I would say, because of that popularity of the whole notion of zone 2, now I would say that muscular endurance is probably the
Mm.
area where most people could improve their understanding. And I'll briefly describe why I think this is the case. So traditionally, even athletes who did a high volume of low intensity training, then they would add on and bring into their program higher intensity, typically through interval workouts. A classic interval workout would be 5 times 4 minutes with 4 minutes rest. Very common in almost all endurance sports.
Mhm.
But the thing, and what will happen when you do that kind of training, is you will get a significant muscular endurance training effect, because the muscles are working a lot harder during those intervals than they would be in the low intensity. The problem with that can be, and I've seen it repeated many times, so I think it's pretty universal, is that doing that high intensity training has a really profound global fatiguing effect. That, so let's do 5 by 4 minutes. If you're just starting out, once a week is all you'll be able to handle of that stuff. Maybe as a more elite athlete can get up to doing that twice in a week, so there you get 40 minutes of that stimulus. But what I have seen over the years is when people jump right from, they start adding high intensity training onto their layering on top of their base, is that they they don't have the muscular endurance to complete that interval workout at the correct
Mhm.
intensity or speed. So let's just say, we're using a really simple example from the track, and let's say we're going to do, 800 meters or whatever, it doesn't matter, mile repeats, and you set a pace for yourself that you hope to hit, or you set a heart rate zone that you're trying to maintain. Almost universally, what I see with, I mean, even with high level athletes is they're they slow down. And after about the third one of these, second or third one of these things, they're going a lot slower than they were in the first one. And it's because of local muscular fatigue. And as a consequence, the training effect of that workout isn't as good as it could or should be. So what we try to do, and I think this is pretty unique, I don't know of other coaches or other programs or other philosophies that do this, is we do some specific muscular endurance training leading into or before that conventional interval training. So anyway, that's kind of a
Mhm.
long-winded answer, but I hope that helps folks.
Yeah, I agree with you, Scott. With the zone two, it's become quite a buzz on the internet. But I think this person's question, if you dissect it, it's the actual gaps in the training theory. I think a lot of people can latch on to, like, their friend says, "I you need to do zone two, so you just do zone two," or your friend says you need to do hit, so you do hit. But actually delving into some of the articles that you've written or the book as to why zone two works is important,
Yeah.
I think. Not just Instagram or Facebook or articles that are fluffy, but understanding the theory behind it too will help people apply it
Yeah.
properly, because there's so many zones. I get this question almost every week as a coach, with Garmin zones and Cinto
Mm.
zones, and but if you understand your what an aerobic threshold is, um, you can adapt zones yourself and understand them. So I think that's important.
That's a really good point, Kylie. Thanks. I probably didn't think deeply enough about my answer, although I think my answer is still valid. What we're seeing is there are a few training theories and principles that I think are not particularly well understood. Another one that's right, and I mean, just very briefly, I can say, you know, we understand why the aerobic base is important from a physiological standpoint well enough now to say that the in my belief, and I've demonstrated, I've written about this especially in the second book, is that, or no, the first book, I guess, maybe both. Anyway, the vacuum cleaner effect, that the
Mhm.
aerobic base is like a big vacuum cleaner. And what I mean by that is it's going to be able to take up the lactate that's being produced in the faster twitch, higher force fibers during high intensity work and metabolize that and use it for energy so it doesn't
Mhm.
accumulate. Because even though lactate itself may not be the reason we have fatigue, it the elevated lactates always coincide with fatigue. And
Mhm.
so you can use it even again, if it's not the cause, at least it's a good marker. And so by training zone two, you're improving the ability to do something useful with that lactate. Because the lactate comes to a fork in the road
Mhm.
initially, where it can be shuttled out of the muscle into another muscle fibers nearby, or it can just start accumulating in the cytosol of the cell. And when that happens, again, not necessarily because that's the cause, but when that happens, we see lactates are higher.
Mhm.
So anyway, so
Yeah.
that is in a nutshell why zone two is important. And that's one of those things that kind of I'm upset about when I read and see these, very successful influencers and podcast people talking about zone two, but they don't ever talk about why and what's
Mhm.
happening
Mhm.
there. And it took me years to figure out, like, why
Hmm.
are we doing what's we know aerobic base training is really important. People have been doing it for 100 years, but why? And then
Yeah.
finally, I was reading George Brooks's work, who in 1982 discovered this thing called the lactate shuttle. And
Mm.
that's when I went, oh, now I connect these dots. Now I see what's going on
Yeah.
here. So anyway,
Hmm.
there's
Yeah.
there's a whole thing of misunderstood and misarticulated theory out there. We could probably have a whole podcast just on that.
For sure. And we say zone two, we use a four zone system, but people do even just get really hung up on that word zone two. But you need to understand what that means to adapt whatever zone system you're using as well. Because if you're using 5 zones, 7 zones, which is, we've talked about this, maybe another question, unnecessary likely, but some people do and some watches do. And then maybe your aerobic threshold isn't your zone two. So it's, you have to understand what it means. I think that's the
Yeah,
moral of that story. Yeah.
for sure. Yeah, we should
Yeah.
maybe. I mean, I did the kind of a deep dive on the zone system in one of the articles, I believe, and maybe even a podcast a while back. But I think it is something that's misunderstood. And when I see those 7, even 9 zone systems that Training Peaks puts out, I
Hmm.
just think no one can parse their their metabolic response to exercise down to within 3 beats, heart rate beats. Um,
Hmm.
so it might work, a 7 zone system. I think a 9 is way overkill, but a 7 zone system, maybe if you were a cyclist, training on a stationary bike where
Hmm.
you can control the power within a very small range, then I could see how you could make your zones power-based zones, not heart rate-based zones. But for most of our
Right.
people, heart rate is kind of, as everybody knows, kind of our default.
Hmm. Yeah. Good.
Well,
Okay,
we
let's
better
go to
jump
the
on
next
to,
question.
yeah,
Yeah.
good. We should definitely move on. Sorry for
So
everybody for beating that horse.
our our next question, Scott, is if doing 3+ hours of zone 1/2 cardio, can you finish the last hour with some zone three? Would this inhibit the 2 hours at zone one, 1, 2? Basically, do zones 1 and 2 workouts have to maintain the entirety to be most effective, even when doing over 3 hours? This is from Melissa.
This would depend on the athlete. If a person is, aerobically deficient, which if you don't understand that term, it's in the books, it's on the website, you can read about it. If a person is aerobically deficient, then they really just need to focus on that zone 2, even at the omission of zone 1. And then in that case, doing almost any kind of high intensity training, especially on, several, many minutes, almost an hour, it sounds like this person is suggesting, then you would be not necessarily negating the effects of the aerobic base training, but you would be slowing down the adaptation probably.
Mhm,
Now, if a
mhm.
person is better trained than that, then this type of a workout is pretty common. We use it, and it's called a progressive workout. So the coach might specify heart rate zones. Here's what I want the first 15 or the first 30 minutes are like this. Next 30 minutes are, 5 beats higher. Next,
Mhm.
and so you over the course of a 3-hour workout, the intensity increases even to the point, and I've used this with cross country skiers in the past, even to the point where like the last 4 or 5 minutes are full out race pace, hard as they can go. It's a very
Mhm, mhm,
taxing workout, but it's super effective. So
mhm,
I would say, Melissa, you know, weigh this, if you can handle it and you're recovering well, then probably because you're asking this question, I'm assuming you're not aerobically deficient and you probably can handle this and probably will see benefits from it.
mhm. Yeah, I will say though, if she's not aerobically deficient, um, 2 hours of zone two and then 1 hour of zone three, that's quite a long time. So
It's a it's
that'd
a
be a
heavy
very,
load.
very hard workout,
Yeah,
for sure.
that's why I was saying it progress. We usually start with pretty low,
Yeah,
a
lower
lot of zone
minutes.
one, and then
Hmm.
because for people who are fit, training in at the upper end of zone 2 is almost like training in zone 3. So it's
Yeah.
muscularly very taxing. Even though metabolically it's still very aerobic, those muscles are working really hard. So the nervous system and the muscles themselves take a bit of a beating in zone 2 for people who are very fit. Now, if you're very unfit from the aerobically, then even walking will cause you to go out of zone 2. And for those people, the intensity or the effort will feel very low, like they're really not doing much. Well, the reason they're not doing much is that's all the energy their puny little aerobic system can put out. So they're forced to go slowly. But again, we see huge gains with this and with people within a few months of this base training. You see a dramatic improvement in both the heart rate response, but also in the pace that they're moving at.
Great. So we'll jump right into the next one, Scott. This is a little different question, but
Yeah.
maybe you can answer it and or defer it. So, as a leader in the military, how do I scale progression of mileage or time in zone when people are leaving or joining the unit in the middle of a progression? For example, a novice runner joins the unit in the middle or later phase of a higher mileage buildup, and regulation dictates that we all conduct our physical training together. This often leads the new soldier at risk of injury. This is an applicable
Mhm.
question for any group training scenario too, not just
Yeah,
military, like a Nordic club or a. Mhm.
exactly. Nordic team. But I think it's
Yeah.
so I didn't we recently did a seminar with one of the special operations groups, and presenting in that seminar was one of our coaches, Vince Pikowski. Vince was in 2022, I believe. He and his partner were the winner of the best ranger competition. Vince is a sub 230 marathon runner. Um, he was a Division I collegiate runner, so has a lot of background in endurance training. And he gave this wonderful presentation because this exact question came up during the seminar. So I am going to read Vince's reply
Perfect.
here because he's had personal experience in this as a company commander in the regular infantry after leaving Rangers, or not leaving Rangers, but after being transferred to conventional infantry. He was a company commander. And so he's worked with people who aren't particularly fit. And so I think this should be really helpful, I hope. And if it's not, Vince or myself would for sure be available for a phone consultation if this doesn't answer this person's question. So here we go. These are Vince's words. One, I think it's important to identify that there is a ceiling to the necessary and wise build of soldiers during their PT time. Working out as a team, in my opinion, is more important than constant progression. Pushing PT down to the squad and team level allows junior leaders to learn to make decisions on where their team is at given new soldiers and rotations. We implemented a plan that kept new soldiers at the company level for PT for a month. This was their processing and indoctrination time. So he says, having a good headquarters NCO and a strong XO is very important here. It's people who will buy into this kind of an idea. Then we ask platoon leaders to keep new soldiers at their levels for another week after that month. This meant 5 weeks of deliberate build at a managed level, and then it's up to the leaders when they come back to the team level training. It's up to the leaders to mentor junior leaders on the risks and progressions. This means an education system down to the lowest levels and buy-in. I found through by having the commanding officer present when the squads were doing some of their PT helped the most because they could slowly mold junior soldiers to the idea that easy, long, consistent work is valuable and works especially well long term. Finally, all new soldiers should be taking a PT test, and junior leaders should have serious conversations about where soldiers are and where they can be in a quarter or a half a year or a full year. And then he wrote back to me. I asked him this question this morning, and he wrote back and he said, a commander can make standards in addition to current ones and hold those in the unit to them. For us, this was a team PT competition held at the team level every month. The competition never changed. It was in full body armor and included 2 miles of movements and a bunch of team carries. We always rewarded the top teams, and I would have serious conversations with the team leaders who weren't seeing improvement. So make a standard, hold people accountable, and foster some competition. And the time when this is, well, the reason I think this question is being asked is how do we keep these folks from being injured? But I remember Vince very specifically addressing this at this last seminar we did. It says, and I think it's reinforcing the idea that if you don't arrive at an objective as a team, you're worthless. So train together, protect and build your weakest link, even if that means your top performers aren't getting as quality of training as they might otherwise. High physical performers often do extra PT on their own anyway. So I think that final paragraph there sort of sums it up. Is you're going to need to operate as a team in combat, and you can't move any faster than your slowest person. So that has to be your priority, is to get the slowest person faster.
Yeah, that's a very good answer. I'm glad you reached out to Vince. He's very experienced in that area, and he's written some articles. If people are interested in this topic, there's more on our website, I believe, too, from Vince. Yeah, good. Scott, our next question is Mike. It's from Mike, and he said, I recently joined a sauna club where we alternate cold plunges and hot saunas. The cold pool is about 38 to 40 degrees, and the saunas are properly hot, the hottest saunas I've ever been in. Is there a way I should time this contrast therapy with endurance training, including my strength and mobility work? Essentially, could I be slowing down my athletic development with this contrast therapy? Could I be speeding it up? When might either result apply? I've seen reports that there is a link between plain cold water immersion and muscle hypertrophy, but I don't know about contrast therapy and strength/power. Might it be better to start or end with hot or cold? So this is hot-cold therapy has been around a long time. So
yeah, it's a tough question, and my understanding, and which is not very deep, honestly, is that one of the reasons you do this, whether it's heat training or cold training, immersion training, is to increase the level of heat shock proteins that are being that your body's putting out, and those proteins can be helpful for repairing damaged tissues. However, in contrast to that, inflammation, which usually occurs from training, especially a high volume of endurance training, you have inflammation in the muscles. That inflammation is also one of the biggest stimuli to the improvement of aerobic capacity. So there's a follow-on effect of, being in, so like doing a hard workout and then being kind of stiff and sore and then taking a few Advil, that probably counters the effect of the training. And because these are all these things we're doing, heat and cold, tend to be designed, I believe, especially the cold, to mitigate that inflammation and make you feel better. But in theory, that ought to slow adaptations. I don't have enough. I'm sure there have been studies done on this, and I recently saw a podcast with Peter Attia, and I won't try to quote it here, but people can find it. It's fairly recent, where he says we made a mistake about contrast. Because for years, you might remember, he's been a huge believer in this and he's pushed it really hard. So go read that for someone who's more expert on this. But I would say, you know, well, I hate to give recommendations because I don't really know. I don't have
Mm.
any athletes, and I've never worked with. Well, no, that's not true. One year I worked with a cross country skier who's a 3-time Olympian, and well, I shouldn't say worked with him one year, but anyway, I worked with this guy who was a 3-time Olympian. And after hard training sessions, he would take a little lawn chair that I had and go sit in the river in front of my house
Mhm.
with his legs in the water. And he thought it helped his recovery. Now, again, in theory, it shouldn't have, or maybe it helps recovery, but it slows adaptation. I'm not really sure. Um,
Mhm.
but I think there's no other athlete I have ever worked with, and Kylee, I want you to chime in on this, has
Mhm.
done this heat and cold contrast therapy before. So I don't have
Mhm.
any real working experience with it at all. Have you seen it before?
Yeah, when I was a speed skater on the national team at the training center in Calgary, it was really common to do cold therapy. Not so much hot cold, but cold. So you would go in and there was literally ice floating. Um, but I agree with you now. From articles I've read, I've personally, I also like sitting in a river, kind of like your athlete, but I kind of I think it's one of those things a lot like we've talked about other nutritional supplements and things. It's a very person to person effect. So I think, or like athlete to athlete. So for one athlete, they might not think it does anything and it's not helpful, and then someone like your cross country skier, myself, really likes cold. So I think maybe I'm open to say there's likely a psychological effect as well, so
Yeah, could
as
be.
well
Yeah.
as physiological, but I think yeah, experimenting yourself is kind of likely the best method with that one. But
And and
uh,
and we could,
mhm,
oh, go ahead, sorry, but we could
mhm.
probably pro extend this conversation to talk about heat training.
Yeah.
Now, there's an area where I think universally it's accepted that training in elevated temperatures where you get your body core temperature goes up to 40 plus degrees centigrade, um, is has a powerful training
Mhm,
effect.
mhm.
And so maybe if you put your stationary bike in this sauna, you would really get a benefit from that. But most of the elite athletes I've worked with do heat training, and they do it all the time. And
Yeah.
then one of the folks I was coaching for quite a while, Dirk Friel, his father, Joe Friel, wrote all kinds of books about training for triathlons and running and that sort of thing. But Dirk owns Training Peaks. And so I was helping him get ready for skimo race that he did this winter. And after that race, he went over to Europe because Training Peaks, most of the Tour de France peloton is on Training Peaks, if not all. And
Mhm,
so he went over to kind of hobnob and do some PR work with all these different teams. So he traveled around Europe to meet with these teams in their training camps. And he actually texted me, said, I just got done with this session with talking with Chris Froome. Some people might remember, former Tour de France leader or winner. And Chris is now running a team apparently, and they're doing stationary bike heat training every single day.
mhm.
And no, in cycling, I can see because it's a summer sport and it can get really hot. I could see where that might be more advantageous. But again, I think it's well proven that heat training helps you be, and the mechanism is that it increases your blood plasma volume. And
Mhm.
so now and in response to having a higher plasma volume, your body will make more red blood cells to keep your hematocrit at a safe level. So you end up with more oxygen carrying capacity in the blood from heat training. That's
Mhm.
my understanding of it.
Yeah, I think I'm not sure if what Mike if he was asking hot cold in terms of recovery or in
I think
terms
he
of
is.
training benefits, but we should clarify that they are kind of different things. There's the therapy side of recovery with hot cold, and then there's heat training, which is, as you said, something a lot of athletes are doing, and that's not that isn't for recovery. It's for training enhancements
Yeah.
and benefits,
Good,
right? So,
good point.
mhm.
Thank you for making that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, good. Our next question is a little bit case study like, Scott. So I'll read some information and then we'll delve into the questions.
You
Um,
bet.
th- this is one of our athletes who've worked with a coach here at Evoke, and her name's Silpa. And she has been training for the last 5 years. And when she first started training, her aerobic threshold was 153 to 155 heart rate, and her pace was 16 minutes per mile. So she had aerobic deficiency syndrome. Um, and now she's improved her aerobic threshold to 161 to 162 at an 11:45 minute per mile. Her anaerobic threshold prior to this was 173 and max heart rate was 184. And now she has also improved that to 189. So she has seen progression with her coach over working at Evoke here. But she's saying my recovery is slower and longer when I do too much zone two now. I've realized my speed at aerobic threshold has plateaued. This could be my age or genetics, but I do recover really well, even from hard training sessions now. I would like to spend, I would like my speed in the mountains to be better, but I honestly don't know if I have any room for growth with being limited in terrain to do speed work and starting this approach later in life. So maybe we should just quickly first touch on that question. When someone's aerobically deficient, they've been training with someone for 5 years. Have you seen a plateau? Like, is there a limit to people's aerobic threshold improvement?
Yes, there will be a genetic limitation. Some people are super adapters, other people are, I've never seen a non-adapter to this aerobic base training, but definitely people are going to adapt in different at different rates and have greater or lesser benefits from it, improving speed at their aerobic threshold. That's talent, that's genetics, and there's really nothing you can do about that. Age is another factor that we really can't do anything about
Mhm.
because
Yeah.
as you age, it becomes harder and harder to maintain some of these qualities. Um, and so, yeah, it is possible to see plateaus. Normally, the first thing we see is a plateau in the heart rate, that at aerobic threshold, because in this case, she's only 10 beats below her anaerobic threshold. So that
Mhm.
makes zone 3 very small,
Yeah.
only 10 beats wide. And but what I have seen is that this pace can continue to improve for years and years. There's a
Mhm.
really famous case study on this with Mark Allen, the
Mhm.
triathlete who won the Ironman triathlon in Hawaii, I think 5 or 6 times back in the 80s.
Mhm.
And his coach, who was Phil Maffetone, had him doing just consistently over the number of, I don't know how many, 6 or 7 years he was working with Mark, had him do a lot of this aerobic base training, what we would call zone 2 now. And his pace got over the course of, no, it was not 5, 6 or 7 years. It was actually 10 years. Over the course
Mhm.
of 10 years, his aerobic threshold pace kept improving. Now,
Mhm.
here's an elite athlete with obviously good genetics. Can everybody improve for 10 years? Probably not. Um, I've noticed a plateau as I've aged that I'm not
Mhm.
able to run much faster aerobic threshold. In fact, I can barely keep from sliding backwards.
Yeah,
But
I was
anyway,
gonna
I think,
ask you
go ahead.
that, I was gonna ask you that, Scott, because like I'm 41 and I feel similar, like I'm maintaining my aerobic threshold with a lot of training. But is there a age that you've seen people, it actually starts to go the other way, like your aerobic threshold declines even if you train a ton?
Yes, because the whole heart rate scale shifts downward as we age. So when you
Right.
were speed skating when you were 12, you probably had
Hmm.
a maximum heart rate of 220 beats or something
Yeah,
crazy,
it was over 200 for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, and now what is it?
Now it's like 188 or 189. Yeah.
Okay, so you've lost probably 20 beats in 30 years.
Yeah.
Somewhere in that range. Okay.
Hmm.
And that's inevitable. It happens to all of us. And it does create problems because your your heart's capacity to pump blood is based on two things. One is what's called the stroke volume, the amount
Hmm.
of blood that gets ejected with each beat of the heart. And the other is the heart rate. And the product of those two, so stroke volume times heart rate, gives the cardiac, what they call the cardiac output. Even if your stroke volume stays the same, your cardiac output is going to go down because your heart rate, your maximum heart rate is going to decrease with age. And
Hmm.
that, like when I was, swimming when I was a boy, um, seeing 200 beats per minute was typical in interval type
Yeah.
workouts. And they weren't, they didn't feel particularly stressful that hard. And when I, 10 years later, when I was ski racing more, I was 185 was my max. Never got
Right.
it above that. And now I don't haven't tested it because it's so uncomfortable to test it, and I'm not sure what it would tell me, except that I'm getting
Hmm.
old. That I would be hard pressed to hit 160 now at
Yeah.
71 years old. So unfortunately, there is something to this. It's age and genetics, but that shouldn't stop any of us. It doesn't stop me, and from trying. You have to
Yeah.
try.
But I was curious, Scott, like your VO2 and your max heart rate declines, but your aerobic threshold, like for example, you asked what my max is probably about
Mhm.
189. My aerobic threshold has held steady at about 170 for quite a few years. So it's still quite
Mhm.
high, but that takes a lot of training. At some point, I'm assuming like your aerobic threshold has declined too,
Oh,
or
yes.
or can maintain that for longer? I don't know.
No, so what I said first, I'll go back and say it again. The
Yeah,
whole heart rate scale shifts
the
downward
whole.
as you age.
Yeah.
And
Hmm.
so, whereas when I was, fit and running and ski racing a lot, I would have easily could sustain 165 beats for, over an hour.
Sure.
Um,
Yeah.
but and my aerobic threshold then was in the 150. So I had a very,
Mm.
small zone 3.
Yeah.
Now, as I was mentioning, the whole thing has shifted down the scale so that now
Hmm.
my aerobic threshold, even like 5 years ago, I think my aerobic threshold was like 140.
Mm.
Now I'd say it's closer to, around 130, and it just
Right.
keeps sliding down. And
Yeah.
because even if my stroke volume stays the same, by having this lower heart rate that I'm operating at, it means I have to run slower in those, to
Yeah.
stay in that zone.
Yeah, I think that this brings up like an interesting point about aging, and I think you can do amazing things as you age, but as high performance athletes, it's also important to have realistic expectations too, um, as well, because nobody can fully beat that, right? So I think
Mhm.
it is okay to feel proud of yourself if you're an older age and you do something similar to what you did when you were younger. Maybe you didn't improve that much, but that's an accomplishment. Maintaining
Mhm.
is quite good, I
And it's
think.
and then
Mhm.
maintaining is tough the older you get. So,
Yes,
but
yes, for
yes.
sure. Yeah.
Well, Silpa
Okay.
has a couple of other
Yeah.
questions here we better dive into. So
Yes.
why don't you
So
fire away?
So Silpa went to Nepal to do some trekking, And she said that her aerobic threshold was close to 13 minutes per mile after her Nepal trip. So she felt some regression after her trip. And she's asking if it could be because she did a lot more zone 3 prior to leaving for her trip. Or do you see this as a result of fatigue from that kind of a expedition? Um, and so she's asking how she can get her gains back after her trip back to the level she was.
Well, it could be that you were just carrying some low-level fatigue from all the trekking and the stress of being at high altitude. That easily could explain why you regressed in your aerobic threshold. And you may have been exercising at higher than zone 2 for much of that if you were working hard, carrying a pack, hiking uphill, those sorts of things.
Mhm.
But it says she just says that it took me a good month to get back to where she was, and then she
Mhm.
says now I have increased my zone 1 to low zone 2 and cut back on my zone and cut back on zone 3. My speed has improved. That's because you're emphasizing this is zone 2 training, and your
Mhm.
speed at your aerobic threshold is starting to show signs of increasing. So that's a good thing.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, and then Silpa's last question, she says, and you talked about this a little bit earlier, I think, but I'm so lost with muscular endurance work. I have even read your newer article on the website. I understand the concept of having a big aerobic base, slow twitch fiber, and fast twitch fibers, but just can't seem to apply it on myself. I have even trained with 55 pounds. For reference, I'm 129 pounds and 5'4" in my backpack on incline at 22% or and on the Stairmaster. I'm slow and it feels hard, but just don't feel the local muscle fatigue in my legs that I'm looking for. I know that feeling, the burning in the calves on Island Peak that I felt. Yeah, so Silpa feels the burn with gym-based ME work, but not on the weighted carrying.
Yeah.
She says, I still continue to use 25 pound vest for 60 minutes once every 10 days on the Stairmaster and alternate with zone 3, 3 times 3 minutes work with the vest as I have seen the benefits from it. So that's kind of an interesting question. Someone who
It
finds
is.
gym ME effective, but not weighted carrying, perhaps the
Yeah, and
feeling.
so
Mhm.
here's a thought for you, Silpa, is that um, maybe you need to talk to your coach, periodize a block of gym ME based training leading into this weighted uphill carries. But the other thing I might say is before you do the weighted uphill carries, it might be beneficial. I think for most women, especially as they age, it's even more beneficial than for men to do more strength training. And
Mhm.
so you might want to focus on things like a box step up with with a fairly heavy weight, not done in a muscular endurance protocol where you're doing a lot of repetitions and not that much rest. This would be, sets of 4 to 5 reps max, somewhere in that 3 to 5 rep range, but with a
Mhm.
weight that you could just barely do those reps with. So about, should be like 90% of your 1 rep max. But it could be that you just need to strengthen your legs enough because strength is what controls speed. I mean, you have to be powerful to be fast, and power is based on strength. So if you've said you feel slow in the mountains and you feel slow on the treadmill or the stairmaster, that I think you might want to put in a period of max strength training, maybe 1 or 2 days a week of that first, and see if that doesn't get your legs to where they'll fire up a little more.
Okay. Moving right along here, Scott. Our next question is from Karen, and she says, I currently do 6 hours per week of aerobic training. My goals are to get fitter for hiking, scrambling, alpine climbing, but easy climbs, backcountry skiing, and trail running. Is it better to do the same modality in cycles as opposed to mm, mixed? I'm assuming mixing the activities.
Mhm.
Can I still make gains doing only a couple hours a week of each activity? It seems like I'm no longer making gains and wondering if switching all my training doing one thing will be better. I do a couple hours each of Stairmaster hiking, incline treadmill, and trail running. I found when I was newer to this, I could make gains from doing these mixed modalities.
Yeah,
Okay.
this is a trick for people who want to be kind of all around. Now,
Mm-hmm.
the good news is that most of these things, whether it's running, hiking, scrambling, backcountry skiing, all those rely on this aerobic base we've been talking about. Now, but there is a thing called specificity. And there is a reason that elite athletes train specifically for one event. It's incredibly rare to see a person excel at two different, even if they're endurance sports. It's a freakish occurrence. So the reason is that we adapt, your body adapts to the stimulus that you're giving it. And if the stimulus, eventually that stimulus will stop having the same effect. We like with SILPA, you will eventually reach your genetic limitation. This is like, okay, your genes are this, and this is as good as you're going to get. So regardless of maintaining the stimulus, the body goes, oh, I'm maxed out. So I think in this case, what I would suggest would be, you know, you may want to seasonally shift your training so that when you're getting ready for hiking and easy alpine climbs, then you're on the stairmaster, on outside doing those things, or in steep incline trainer, something like that. If you're focused on running, then you would need to, and I think that first thing I was just talking about would also apply to backcountry skiing. So
Mm-hmm.
we do this with a number of our athletes, is put them on a incline trainer or a stairmaster with a moderately heavy pack, not like a muscular endurance workout, but then use ankle weights. And for most people, like 2 kilograms, excuse me, 1 to 2 kilograms would be plenty. And that can be a really good training, I believe, for backcountry skiing because it sort of simulates the weight on your foot. Even though most, depending on the kind of gear you have, I mean, Kylie's racing gear is probably not even 2 kilograms, but most people's touring gear is going to be 4 or 5 kilograms. But I think shifting to more specificity for you would be good. The problem with specificity is you run the risk of overuse injuries, overtraining. I mean, there's a reason that elite athletes are kind of always on the edge of injury and sickness. They just keep pounding their body in the same way each time. So from a health standpoint, what you're doing, especially if you find it enjoyable, I
Mm-hmm.
say stick with it, even if you're not making huge gains anymore. Another thing you might consider is adding some high intensity in. It could be that
Mm-hmm.
you've kind of maxed out your slow twitch muscle fibers adaptations, but starting to add some zone 3 training when you're hiking or on the Stairmaster or something, I think could help you break through the plateau.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a very common, we get a lot of clients like this. So because our followers and we all love the mountains and lots of different activities. So
Yeah.
I found pretty good success honing in on like two activities each season. So for example, in the summer, like run slash hike and biking or something. Um, keeping it a little bit pared down helps. And then if you have any sort of event, that specificity phase, we have articles on that. But you would want to just only do, like if you had an alpine climb coming up, probably the 10 days before that, you would just want to focus on anything pertaining to that, that kind of um, blocks of specific work. But um, our next question, Scott. Here is from Cheryl, and she says, this year I have a road marathon race in December, which is my A race. I was trying to break 3 hours for a few years, and this year I wanted to give it another shot. I also have a 100K race in July, mainly to qualify for Western states. I just came off a ski season, downhill resort style only, so I need to catch up with running, and started the Big Vert Ultra Marathon training plan for the 100K training. My question is, if my goal for the 100K race is to build a base for my road marathon race, how should I adjust my training? I'm thinking about replacing some weekend long trail runs with 16 to 20-mile long road runs. Or should I replace some muscular endurance sessions or uphill zone 3 sessions with track threshold sessions? My second question is, in the Big Vert plan, the hill
Let's
sprints.
let's
Okay,
let's answer the
let's
first
pause.
question, because this is
Yeah.
kind of a long question here.
Yeah.
Well, I'd say if your goal is to break 3 hours, then you need to do a lot of training at the pace you need to maintain. And so, yes, adding those 16 to 20-mile long road runs will be beneficial. And you can start with those, include maybe the first one you do, maybe you're going to include 30 minutes at your target pace in your 16 miles. Then, as you progress, you'll be getting up to like an hour, and then eventually, before your race, you'd like to get to the point where you can do a 16-mile tempo run at your marathon pace, because that's going to do two things. One is it's very specific to the event you're training for, and it's a whole lot easier to train for events like road running than it is for training for mountain running, because mountain running, the paces vary. There's some bigger strength components to it. But training for this marathon is relatively straightforward. And you could, again, the muscular endurance sessions and the uphill zone 3 sessions are really meant to help you have a better fatigue resistance for the mountain running. They're not
Mm-hmm.
going to help you, maintain a 7.5 minute mile pace or whatever 3 hours is. I can't remember. Maybe it's 8 minutes. They're not going to really benefit that. So if your goal is this marathon, I would, really focus on that and use the 100. I think your running speed, depending on how hilly the ultra running or the 100K is, this faster road running will definitely carry over to your trail running for
Mm-hmm.
some of it. Maybe you won't climb as well as you would have if you were doing more specific uphill training. But I think
Mm-hmm.
a good part of this marathon training will transfer over to the trails.
Yeah, I'm not as familiar with our running plans, Scott, because I haven't written any of them. But the Big Vert Ultra Marathon training plan for the 100K
Mhm.
training, would that maybe not even be the right plan for breaking 3 for a marathon? I don't know. I didn't.
Well, yeah, I don't think it's a good plan for breaking 3 hours. No.
Yeah.
That training plan was written by Mike Foote,
Hmm.
back when we were all of us were at Uphill Athlete. And Mike and I worked together on that plan. I think it's a great plan. I was really
Hmm.
proud of it when we put it out. We used to get tremendously good feedback on it. But what it has is it allows you to adjust the training volume and vertical, based on the event that you're training for. So you can
Okay.
scale it from like a trail marathon to a
Um,
100-mile
Perfect.
race.
Okay.
And so it's kind of a complex plan because of that. But
Hmm.
it's definitely not geared towards someone with a marathon goal. I mean, we do
Hmm.
have a marathon plan, and it
Hmm.
includes these tempo runs that I was just talking about. So I think you're heading in the right direction with those.
Great. Yeah. Her second question is, there's a workout in the Big Vert plan. She says that's a hill sprint workout, and it extends to some longer hill repeat sessions, 30 seconds
Mhm.
to 2 minutes. She says, I don't find anything in your book about sessions like this. It definitely does not fall into the hill sprints category. Are there any benefits of these workouts? If I were to do them, would I still do it on a slope as steep as possible? I felt I could not sustain more than 20 seconds on steep hills where
Yeah.
I do my hill sprints. Mhm.
Yeah, great question. And you're right. You kind of caught me. There, I didn't really talk about this in the book, but progressing from very short, high-powered hill sprints up to longer sessions, 30 seconds, a minute. I didn't, or maybe there's 2 minutes. I can't remember. That starts to build anaerobic endurance, which can, and muscular strength, muscular power, muscular endurance, all those things has a really pronounced effect on those. Whereas in the beginning, the when you're doing just the hill sprints, that's really just very straightforward old school power training. And so the idea is you develop the power first with a block of hill sprint training, and then eventually, as you get closer to your event, you begin to include some of these extended uphills. Now, obviously, they won't be sprints if they're 30 seconds or a minute long. You can't
Mhm.
sprint for 30 seconds. So you're right that you won't be able to sustain for more than 20 seconds, you say, where you do hill sprints. I would say steep is better. So
Mhm.
20% is kind of the range we often try to suggest people use, which is steeper than most trails.
Mhm.
Um, so does that sound like I hit that, Kylie?
Yeah, that makes sense, and I understand her confusion actually when I moved from being a sprinter as a speed skater to endurance training. I remember my coach giving me like 5 times 1 minute hill sprints, and I wrote back and said, "Impossible, I will die."
Yeah.
Because in certain sports, like if you take sprint very literally, um, so yes, she's correct. She couldn't do her steep hill longer than the 20 seconds. She'll have to have a paced effort. And yes, like you said, it does have benefits, but it's a little bit different workout than like a true sprint, if that makes
Yeah.
sense. So
Yeah,
yeah.
and this I would consider this the the least important training that especially for an ultra runner that they could do is that they're um, training anaerobic endurance or power endurance, however you want to call it, is the least important thing. If you might remember that I think it was in one of Killian's articles, or maybe he put in the book, I don't remember. He talked about he does like 3 of these workouts in a year. So
Wow.
it's not a foundational part of anybody's training. It's what you might do during
Mhm.
a peaking cycle. So
Mhm.
maybe for
Mhm.
3 weeks straight and peaking, you might do, maybe you start with 30 seconds, move to 45, move to a minute. Um,
Mhm.
yeah. So
Yeah.
it's kind of the frosting on top of the cake.
Great. Our next question, Scott, is from Zach, and he says, I'm mainly a CrossFit and strength training athlete who is in the early stages of building aerobic capacity and fixing my aerobic deficiency syndrome. I am moving from sea level to Colorado Springs at 6,500 feet. I am planning on doing most of my cardio on trails, which will have elevation gain. I am almost certain I won't be able to maintain a zone 2 heart rate at elevation with incline. Would you recommend I just run as slow as possible until my fitness catches up and I'm able to run in zone 2 at elevation? Um, I guess that's a good question.
Yeah. Yeah, it is
Yeah.
a great question. Well, the first thing,
Yeah.
Zach, is if you're coming from sea level to 6,500 feet, you're going to experience, I mean, there is about almost 30% less oxygen in each breath you take at 6,500 feet compared to sea level. So since oxygen is the main reason we're breathing and that's what's being transported to the muscles, you're going to have to slow down. Now, so I first give yourself a period of, several weeks, 3, 4 weeks of very low intensity. You could just be hiking to acclimatize to this new elevation. And
Mm.
then what I'd do is I would redo whatever kind of way you did to determine your aerobic threshold, I'd redo that test because your aerobic threshold heart rate at elevation is going to be definitely lower than it is at low elevation. So, yeah, redo the test, keep it really easy the first few weeks, and then use that new aerobic threshold you've determined with the test to set your zones for training at that elevation. And if it requires you to walk on the uphills, that's fine. You know, there's
Hmm.
nothing wrong with that. But you really want to, especially if you're trying to cure ADS, which you are, you definitely want to be staying, below that aerobic threshold.
Hmm. Yeah, it sounds like he does have a classic
Sorry, my
case of
phone.
ADS, and I do find that's okay with clients that people are afraid to go too slow, almost, or they're afraid of slow. But if you do truly have quite a large spread, and it's a very classic presentation of ADS, like that's what it takes, and it's okay if you are walking. It's fine.
Yeah.
Embrace it, and it won't be forever, but yeah. I think that's an important piece. Like you always tell that classic story about the Olympic Nordic skier who had to basically train by himself because he had to go so slow. I mean, that would have
Yeah.
really been hard on his pride, but it worked.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it does work.
Yeah.
So yeah, it is. And the beauty of doing this lower intensity training is you can handle a higher volume of it. So even if you're in zone one or you're hiking up the hills in zone two, probably your recovery rate will be still pretty good because if you're aerobically deficient, that probably means your muscles aren't working that hard. So you're not going to have the same kind of fatigue that somebody who is fitter will have,
Mhm.
and you can handle a higher volume because
Mhm.
remember the biggest stimulus to aerobic capacity is the volume of training an athlete does. And it's the reason that, and we're going to get to a question here, the reason that professional cyclists are on their bikes 30 hours a week.
Mm.
Professional mountain runners, I have several that are, consistently doing 110 to 130-mile weeks. So,
Right.
but it's, there's obviously they're walking the hills, they're keeping the
Hmm.
intensity low.
So our next question says, I am an admitted, and I admit I'm a Strava addict, and I can't help but notice the amount of volume some of these pro athletes can handle in cycling and running specifically. I'm recently between jobs and can train unlimited. I'm 25 years old and have a history with training. However, I did 1 week like some of my favorite cyclists, 30 hours, and it feels completely unsustainable. Can they do this because of the team around them? More training history? I have extremely good testing numbers, wattage, and VO2, so theoretically would like to work my way or try to be higher level at cycling, I think. But the volume of training is just wow, he says.
Well, yeah, that's so first of all, you have to go back to one of the most important training principles, which is progression. For you to, I don't know what your previous, how many hours you were on your bike previously, but to, let's say it was, 10 or 15 hours, to double that and try a week of it. Well, of course you couldn't sustain it because it's it's 100% increase in what your body is used to doing, and your body's going to rebel, and that would be a continuing on that pathway will be almost assuredly causing you to become overtrained. So what you need to do is two things. One is to start more, don't go to 30 hours. Try bumping up 10% over the volume you've got. Because these guys that are doing this, they've been at it for, 20 years probably, or thereabouts, 15 at least. And
Mhm.
so they've had all this time to develop this ability to handle that high volume. And then the second thing, besides progressing it more slowly, the second thing is to keep the intensity lower. So you just have to, they're not riding hard. They're not at their functional threshold power for 30 hours. You can be sure of that. There's an enormous amount. I mean, you've probably, I'm sure, watched a lot of cycling training videos, and you notice these pros riding along and they're just chatting to each other. Well, that's because they're in zone one or zone two, maybe. And so the intensity is very low. That's what allows them to handle that volume. And it
Mhm.
might be also that you're looking at the base training period for these guys in their off season. So then they're just trying to accumulate volume. There's probably not that much intensity in their overall program.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think he does have a point when he's saying about, is it because there's a team around them? That is a huge factor too. Like, I believe if you're on a cycling pro team or something, you're not then coming home having to prepare your meals and all these things. Usually they get fed, and there's coaches, and there's a lot of support that does a lot of other nitty gritty life things too. So
Sure.
um,
Good
I
point.
think, and physios and doctors and all of the recovery, every recovery tool that they can access, they have access to as well. So that's also a
Yeah.
difference between an amateur and the highest level, I think. So
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. Good point.
The next question, this one's for you, Scott, directly says, "Hi, Scott. I'm 80 years old and still climb and hike. I know muscle mass declines with age starting at 40, but being really old now, are there other significant age markers where declines increase, like 60 or 70? Also, balance seems to have gone a bit to shit at age 70. Thoughts on this from a physiological perspective?"
Yeah, I'm coping with the same thing. So I think I don't know if I'm an expert at it because, you only get to do this once in your life, go through this stage. But what I've uh, definitely discovered is, yes, strength and muscle mass start to go diminish. So you have to spend more time, let's say, doing supplementary strength training to
Mm,
support your climbing and hiking now than you did when you were, 30 years old. So that's the first thing I would suggest. And then, are there declines that happen? Yeah, I believe the decline accelerates as we age, frankly. And my
mm,
experience is like a year or two, I can't do the things I could do even 2 years ago.
mm,
Now that at 71. So I think that yes, it seems like, yeah, when you passed, at 50, I didn't really notice being older. I mean,
mhm,
I wouldn't have been as fast in pure speed, that's for sure. But I could still go out and, do long days in the mountains, running, skiing, alpine
mhm,
climbing with people half my age. But then around 60, I really began to notice that decline happening. And then
mm,
I think at 70, I've begun to see, yeah, the decline accelerate. Um, and then as far as balance, I've actually noticed the same thing,
mm,
that my balance I mean, I've never been like a slackliner or anything like that, but my
yeah.
balance is so much worse now, like
Mm,
standing on one foot and putting on a sock or on the other foot. It's a challenge for me now. So, and what I've done to try to offset that, I believe, while there may be some effects in your ear that are
mm,
upsetting, making your balance go bad. I don't know that. I'm not an expert on balance. But what I've decided, I mean, I probably can't do anything about what's going on in my inner ear, but what I can do is try to strengthen my single leg stance. So, doing more specific glute med exercises, because it's really the glutes and the core muscles that control your pelvis, and your pelvis is kind of the center of gravity. So, if you can't control your pelvis very well, then my theory is that your balance is going to be it's going to go to shit, like you say. So probably wise to really start focusing on single leg exercises that improve the strength in the hips.
mhm. No, that's great advice, and yeah, it is super common. I have parents in this age demographic, and like preventing falls and such in sport and life, especially as you maybe get in, hopefully into your like like he's in his 80s or his 90s even is a
Mhm.
huge thing to try to do. So that single leg stuff sounds important for sure. Next question, Scott. This person says, my knees hurt running downhill. Are my knees just not quote unquote good at going downhill, or is there something I can do to condition better? I love running trail races, but I'm slow on the down, and that is my kryptonite.
Hmm. Yeah, there is definitely something you can do. Now, there is a possibility that your knees are not good, as you say,
Hmm.
but the only way you're going to know that is with, a doctor or a really good physiotherapist, someone who can maybe, or maybe it's an MRI or X-rays. Maybe there is something mechanically messed up in your knees. But let's put that
Hmm.
aside because that's a whole different question. What are you going to do to deal with that? That, maybe it's or surgical is the remedy, which I would put at the very bottom of my list of things to do. But what you can do, and I've done this because I've had knee problems much of my adult life, is really working on strengthening the muscle that's called the vastus medialis obliquus. This is the teardrop shaped muscle above and internally or inside, above your kneecap. And when you flex your leg, you'll see this funny little shaped muscle. And what it does is it controls the kneecap. So we have, especially, I see this a lot with runners. So running is can be for most people, I think it's kind of a quad dominant sport. You're really working your quadriceps. And as you all may know, the four quadricep muscles all attach to the top of the kneecap. And that's how you extend your knees when the quadriceps flex. But the lateral quadriceps, the vastus lateralis being the biggest one, those guys become very trained and well stimulated during running activities.
Hmm.
But the VMO, because the angle of the knee is so small when you're running, maybe your knees are only, going through, 30 to 90-degree range of motion is all. Um, the VMO doesn't get activated until the range of motion in the knee is, more like, I don't know, 80, 70 degrees, 80 degrees, something like that. So you have to have a lot of knee flexion to engage this is why cyclists often have big VMOs. You'll see them standing still and you go, whoa, that's some pretty powerful looking legs because their sport, their knee is bent considerably more than in running. So that's the thing I would think about is, increasing the strength of the VMO. And there are quite a few exercises, but I'm going to recommend that you go on YouTube and search for the knees over toes guy. That's the name of his channel, knees over toes guy. Um, his name is Ben. I've forgotten his last name, but anyway, it's remarkable what he's putting out, everybody. When I've had people who say, "Well, I can't really run because my knees bother me," I
Hmm.
put I have them I give them some exercises and training routines that are basically stolen from this guy Ben. Um, but anyway,
Hmm.
back to the vastus medialis muscle. So if the vastus lateralis becomes too strong, then it begins to pull the kneecap off center, out of track. And your kneecap runs in a bit of a groove. And so that's when you get what's called patellar femoral syndrome. So patella being the kneecap, femur being the end of your thigh bone, and those two start rubbing together, and it's very painful. And the more imbalanced you are between the vastus medialis and the vastus lateralis muscles, the more likely it is to pull that kneecap to the outside and keep it out of track. So all these VMO exercises are geared at strengthening that muscle so it pulls and it keeps the kneecap in tracking better. But anyway, go definitely do some search on knees over toes guy.
Yeah.
I think you'll find that really helpful.
This is great, Scott. I think that a lot of people have this issue or have friends who have this issue. So I think that this will be really helpful information for people. So that's awesome.
You know,
Um,
I've personally used this. So people probably know I've had my knees replaced due to injury and wearing them out. But after my last knee replacement, which was about 7 or 8 years ago, I was really struggling with going downhill.
hmm,
And it was bumming me out big time because I love to run downhill.
mhm,
And a friend, turned me on to the knees over toes guy. And
hmm,
I didn't even take it all that seriously, honestly. I didn't, wasn't doing it 4 days a week. I wasn't really following a great plan. I just did some of his exercises when I felt like it.
yeah.
And within like 2 weeks, my knees
Hmm,
were so much better. And now
amazing.
still I can run downhill even with 2 knee replacements. I run downhill, no problem, no pain. Um,
Awesome.
so
Yeah.
I'm a good testimonial for Ben.
Yeah, for sure. That's awesome. Maybe we could see if we get him on a podcast. That'd be cool. If you're listening,
Yeah.
Ben, send us an email. Um, okay, and Scott, we're at our last question. So we finally made it for our March episode. So our last question is, what is the most effective way or ways to speed recovery when I'm tapering for a running race? If I just sit around, I feel bored and stressed, and my body actually performs worse. Maybe this is just in my head, but seems to be a thing. Should I bike, walk, massage, hot, cold, etc.? Really curious what some of the pros you work with do. Thanks. Thanks.
Well, yeah, this is a really good question too. I'm loving all these questions we're getting from people, Kylie, because they really show people are thinking deeply about this
Hmm.
subject. And so, I hope people will forgive us for going long with these podcasts, but I think it's great. I think it helps the whole community to hear some of
Hmm.
these answers, not just the individual that asked it. Um, there ain't a, there's such a thing as I think I wrote it. Well, I don't think it's up on our website. Is there's such a thing as the taper tantrums, where
Yes.
you stop. Your body's so used to exercising, routinely and probably at a very high volume, that when you stop doing that, you actually do get feeling worse. And I don't think it's in your head. I've seen it way too many times. So you need to continue training in a taper period. And the pros that I work with, and Kylie, you can talk about how you like to taper, but
Hmm.
during the taper, there's a typical taper, let's say for a 100-mile race, might be 3 weeks of stepping down the training. So the first week we cut the training in half, the training volume. Second week we cut the training in half again. Third week we cut the training, the race week we cut the training in half again. And what we do is when we reduce that training volume, we increase the intensity because it seems like it can kind of keeps your nervous system tuned up, makes you feel like you're training. So you'll begin to substitute some type of speed work, faster running or cycling, whatever you're doing, um, oh yeah, tapering for a running race. So
Hmm.
you'll want to add some intensity, but it shouldn't be intensity to utter fatigue. You're just trying to keep enough stimulus on your body so that it doesn't go into this taper tantrum situation.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, no, this is a great question, and I can relate. I have also felt, what did she say, bored and stressed sometimes when you taper. But I think you're totally correct. You do still need to do things, and even as a coach, sometimes I'll program a 30-minute easy jog and stretch just because I know that that person needs to relieve some stress too. Like they'll
Yeah.
just sit around and be anxiety filled. So it's not
Mhm.
really going to hurt them if they go nice and easy, but it will help release those endorphins that athletes are likely addicted to on some level
Yeah.
too, right? So,
Sure. Yeah,
um,
that's a good point.
but Interesting when you were saying that she's tapering for a running race. I think if you have a running race or a race 5 times a year or something, really taking your taper seriously will help your performance immensely. Like Scott was saying, like 3 weeks of tapering. It's funny that you were talking about this question now because when you're a World Cup racer, it's this weird can of worms where you feel like you're perpetually kind of training tapering. And
Mhm.
maybe I think that could be interesting for people maybe when our season's done to talk about athletes who race, every second weekend or every weekend and
Yeah.
even some of the detraining that can happen there. So that's a different topic. But I think for this athlete with, it sounds like a taper for a race, fight those taper tantrums, as Scott says, and take it seriously, but learn about how to do it properly because you're not supposed to just sit on your rump and take up knitting. So don't
Yeah.
worry, you don't have to do
Yes,
that.
definitely not.
Yeah,
Right. Um,
but yeah.
yeah, I think that but to your point, and this is on kind of off topic, but maybe it'll
Hmm.
stimulate some questions for next month, is that you cannot race and train at the same time. And
Hmm.
the reason, I mean, so that's the complication when there's, only 6 days between races. So maybe you have to race twice on each weekend for a while.
Hmm.
What do you do? Well, you've got to have a couple of days of easy recovery afterwards, and then you're going to have a day or two of tapering going into the next race. So that might allow you to do one day of serious work.
Yeah.
And the problem with that is that in leading into this racing season, you were doing, 6 or 7 days of pretty serious work. Maybe they weren't all high intensity, but they were
Hmm.
pretty stressful on your body. And then when you take that away, it's the reason when we tested cross country skiers, they are less fit at the end of the ski season than when they start. And so it's all the more reason to do all of this off-season base training to put that money in the bank so that you can
Hmm.
then be spending it all season long without, bouncing checks, I guess.
Yeah.
Um,
And
yeah,
realizing too, it's been really neat being at the every World Cup in skimo and watching some of the really high performing athletes. And also, I'm a Nordic fan, so watching the Nordic World Cups on Eurosport and stuff. And it was interesting to me, like Klæbo, he just annihilated the World Cup in Trondheim, his home in Norway. And then this last World Cup, he still podiumed, but he looked human, and he came, I think, third. Um, and and to me, that was like confirming that you can have major peaks, but you can't peak every weekend. Like it's
yeah,
impossible. You will have ebbs
yeah,
and flows in a season. Any athlete will, and I think that's
yeah.
and recreational or World Cup level is learning how to um, work through those ebbs and flows in a season as well. Hmm.
The bias that we have towards more training volume is something that I think deserves a little explanation. So when you're training at a pretty high volume or high, let's call it a high training load, so it could be a combination of intensity and volume, um, you're going to be in a state of chronic fatigue during that time. You will not have, when you're in a real building phase, you will not be able to perform at your peak level. But then when we taper off from that, that's when we hope to time the taper correctly and we see the peak performance after that because you're allowing all of this built up fatigue to be, your body to adapt to it and for that fatigue to mitigate over the taper period. And I think one of the biggest mistakes I've seen with athletes, and I know I made this years ago, is they're getting close to the race and they go, "Oh shit, I haven't been doing enough of whatever," and so they
Hmm.
suddenly pile on a whole bunch of this stuff, 2 weeks out from their big race, and of course their body's not used to handling that, and they're
Hmm.
almost guaranteed to have a bad race. And I call that getting greedy with your training. It's like,
Mhm.
okay, and another case of this is when somebody says, well, if a little of this is good, more must be better.
Mhm.
So I'd be very careful about getting greedy in the last few weeks and leading into your training, your
Yeah.
race.
I call that panic training or movie training. You know, when you see
Mm.
Rocky or something, they always
Yeah.
like they just start training super hard 2 weeks before, which actually
Yeah.
is counterproductive for good training. So don't
Yeah.
don't follow the Hollywood movie
No, don't.
methodology. Yeah. But well,
Well,
it was
that,
nice to chat with you, Scott, as always. Good questions this month, I feel.
yeah. Thank you, everyone. We're really liking this, and hopefully people are getting something out of it. So I'll see you next month for the April Ask Evoke.